From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Our goal is to seek justice for Elijah McClain, for his family and friends, and for our state.
In a major development in the movement for police accountability, 3 Colorado police officers and 2 paramedics have been criminally charged in the death of 23-year-old Elijah McClain. They beat him, put him in a chokehold as he pleaded for his life, then injected him with a large amount of the powerful sedative ketamine. His death prompted nationwide protests. Then, the U.S. Supreme Court responds minutes before midnight last night, refusing to halt a Texas law that bans most abortions, ruling 5-4 the ban can remain in effect. We'll get response from Nancy Northup, president of the Center for Reproductive Rights. In Afghanistan, the Taliban say women may not be able to hold senior positions in the new government. We'll go to Kabul to speak with Mahbouba Siraj, president of the Afghan Women's Network, and we look at the role of women in the push for the United States to attack Afghanistan with author Rafia Zakaria. In her new book, Against White Feminism, Notes on Disruption, she calls Afghanistan the first feminist war.
Local groups on the ground in Afghanistan, feminist groups, were protesting the invasion and the occupation, were asking for peace. But of course, all of those voices were mowed down by the sort of white and Western hegemonic feminist industrial complex that had decided that they were going to essentially support the invasion in Afghanistan and export their version of feminism to that country.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The U.S. Supreme Court Wednesday refused to halt the Texas law that bans most abortions, ruling 5-4 the law can remain in effect even while legal challenges against it continue. The ruling is the court's biggest break yet from the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling that legalized abortion nationwide. Chief Justice John Roberts joined the court's 3 liberal justices in their dissent, with Justice Sonia Sotomayor writing, quote, "The court should not be so content to ignore its constitutional obligations to protect not only the rights of women, but also the sanctity of its precedents and of the rule of law," she said. All 5 of the justices who allowed the abortion ban to stay in effect were appointed by Republican presidents, 3 of them by Donald Trump. President Biden said the Texas law, quote, blatantly violates the constitutional right to abortion enshrined in Roe v. Wade. It's the most restrictive anti-choice law in the nation, barring abortions about 6 weeks into a pregnancy before many people even know they're pregnant. There's no exception for rape or incest. The law also allows anyone in Texas to sue patients, medical workers, or even a patient's family or friends who, quote, aid and abet an abortion. This is Alexis McGill-Johnson, president of Planned Parenthood Federation of America.
It's empowering really bad behavior, incentivizing really bad behavior. We're seeing people outside of clinics documenting license plates, taking pictures of people going into clinics. And, it's having its intended effect, right? It's trying to sow chaos and confusion and, most importantly, fear.
Texas clinics say they've had to cancel most of their appointments since the law took effect on Wednesday. Abortion providers say at least 85% of abortions they performed are now outlawed. The remnants of Hurricane Ida swept across the northeastern U.S. overnight, bringing torrential rains, flooding, and even tornadoes to Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. At least 9 people were killed, adding to at least 6 reported deaths in the South, where Ida struck as a Category 4 hurricane over the weekend. The governors of New York and New Jersey declared states of emergency. Here in New York City, subway service was halted and non-emergency vehicles banned from streets overnight amidst heavy flooding. The National Weather Service said over 3 inches of rain fell in Central Park over just 1 hour Wednesday night, likely a new record, while a tornado warning was issued for Manhattan and the Bronx. Meanwhile, over 1 million people in Louisiana and Mississippi still had no power as of Wednesday evening, and 1 million residents either had no running water or were a boil water order. Louisianans are also facing increasingly desperate shortages of fuel, food, and other essential goods. This is a New Orleans resident who survived the hurricane.
I've been a resident here all my life. I haven't seen any change. Every time a disaster comes, we're the last one to be served. We need ice water right now. We don't have no electricity. We're barely surviving through this heat. The gas lines are ridiculous long. We need our leadership to take control.
President Joe Biden is set to visit Louisiana Friday to tour storm damage. The World Meteorological Organization reported Wednesday the climate crisis has spawned extreme weather that's killed more than 2 million people over the last 50 years, with over $3.6 trillion in economic damage. Researchers found a 5-fold increase in the number of extreme weather events compared to 1970. In Afghanistan, the Taliban celebrated its victory over the United States and its NATO allies with a military parade in Kandahar on Wednesday that featured dozens of U.S.-made armored vehicles and a Black Hawk helicopter. Just days after the last U.S. military transport plane left Kabul's airport, the Biden administration said it's exploring ways to evacuate hundreds of remaining U.S. citizens and tens of thousands of Afghan allies, including by land routes. Thousands of refugees have gathered at the border with Pakistan, overwhelming local resources. Those who've been able to cross are begging for international aid.
We are 150 families. It was tough for us to cross the border. We were very oppressed, and many families are stranded there. We were unemployed and hungry. We migrated here because of poverty, and we have to be helped because we don't have tents and food. We have nothing. Have mercy on us.
Meanwhile, U.S. General Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told reporters Wednesday it's possible the United States will coordinate with the Taliban in the fight against the Islamic State. We'll go to Kabul, Afghanistan later in the broadcast for the latest. The United States recorded more than 210,000 coronavirus cases Wednesday as COVID-19 hospitalizations and deaths continue to rise. Here in New York, lawmakers have extended an eviction moratorium through January 15th. New York's the first state to enact renter protection since the U.S. Supreme Court last week threw out a nationwide eviction moratorium ordered by the Centers for Disease Control. In Arizona, more than 1,000 healthcare workers have signed an open letter to the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors, pleading with them to mandate masks in K-12 schools. This week, schools in and around Phoenix reported 227 active outbreaks, with nearly 1,700 students and 450 school employees infected. In Central Texas, the Connolly Independent School District near Waco has canceled classes after 2 teachers died of COVID-19 in the same week. 6th grade social studies teacher Natalia Chancellor was just 41 years old. She died on Saturday, just days after her colleague, 59-year-old Andy McCormick, succumbed to the disease. Their school does not require students or teachers wear masks. In Colorado, 3 police officers and 2 paramedics have been criminally charged in the death of 23-year-old Elijah McClain in the Denver suburb of Aurora, which prompted nationwide protests. McClain, who is African-American, was walking home from a store in August 2019 when someone called 911 to report a suspicious person, although he was not suspected of a crime. The 3 Aurora police officers who answered the call tackled McClain to the ground, placed him in a chokehold as he pleaded for his life, and medical responders who arrived then injected McClain with the powerful sedative ketamine. He suffered a cardiac arrest on the way to the hospital and died several days later. Colorado Attorney General Philip Weiser announced the charges Wednesday.
Our goal is to seek justice for Elijah McClain, for his family and friends, and for our state. In so doing, we advance the rule of law and the commitment that everyone is accountable and equal under the law.
We'll go to Colorado later in the broadcast for an update on the Elijah McClain case. In Nigeria, officials in the northwestern state of Zamfara have closed schools and imposed curfews after gunmen abducted 73 high school students Wednesday. Kidnappers have seized more than 1,000 students in northern Nigeria since December, usually demanding large ransom payments from the children's parents. A U.S. bankruptcy judge has approved a settlement that will dissolve Purdue Pharma, maker of the highly addictive opioid OxyContin, while ordering the Sackler family to pay more than $4.5 billion over the next decade. The agreement shields the Sacklers from future litigation over their role in fueling the opioid crisis, which has killed over 500,000 people across the United States. In a statement, Public Citizen blasted the settlement, saying, quote, allowing the billionaires at the root of the opioid crisis to walk free while thousands of its victims are in prison is a catastrophic injustice, Public Citizen said. President Biden welcomed the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to the White House Wednesday, warning Russia against further military incursions into Ukraine.
And the United States remains firmly committed to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of Russian aggression and our support for Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations.
President Zelensky's first White House visit came 2 years after then-President Donald Trump dangled the prospect of an Oval Office visit in exchange for political dirt on then-candidate Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden. Trump's offer of a quid pro quo led to his first impeachment. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy warned tech and telecommunication companies not to comply with requests from lawmakers investigating the deadly January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, saying Republicans, quote, will not forget if they do. The House Select Committee has requested the companies preserve records related to the attack. McCarthy said the request was illegal, though he did not offer any legal backing for his claim. Meanwhile, here in New York, the director of security and the controller for the Trump Organization are expected to testify before a Manhattan grand jury today as investigations continue into the financial crimes at the former president's businesses. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Nermeen Sheikh. We're both in New York. Hi, Nermeen.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, we're beginning with the major news from the U.S. Supreme Court, which on Wednesday refused to halt a Texas law that bans most abortions, ruling 5-4 the law can remain in effect even while legal challenges against it continue. The ruling is the court's biggest break yet from the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling that legalized abortion nationwide. Chief Justice John Roberts joined the court's 3 liberal justices in their dissent, with Justice Sonia Sotomayor writing, quote, the court should not be so content to ignore its constitutional obligations to protect not only the rights of women, but also the sanctity of its precedents and of the rule of law, she wrote. All 5 of the justices who allowed the abortion ban to stay in effect were appointed by Republican presidents, 3 of them by Donald Trump. President Biden said the Texas law, quote, blatantly violates the constitutional right to abortion enshrined in Roe v. Wade. It is the most restrictive anti-choice law in the nation, barring abortions about 6 weeks into a pregnancy before many people even know they're pregnant. There's no exception for rape or incest. The law also allows anyone in Texas to sue patients, medical workers, a cab driver, or even a patient's family or friends who, quote, aid and abet an abortion. Texas clinics say they've had to cancel most of their appointments since the law took effect Wednesday. Providers say at least 85% of abortions they performed are now outlawed. For more, we're going back to Nancy Northup, president and CEO of the Center for Constitutional Rights. Nancy, we spoke to you yesterday. Welcome back. Talk about the significance of what came down once again just before midnight last night.
Well, we got the order from the court, which you summarized, which was a 5-4 decision allowing this law in Texas to stay in place. We are absolutely devastated. I mean, the inaction of the court not stepping in to block this unconstitutional law means that it will be in effect in Texas for the foreseeable future. Yes, the litigation still goes on, but unfortunately, the Court of Appeals, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, denied our request to hear in an expedited way. The states appealed to that court, and so we are stuck in this limbo. But you know what? People in this country, we should not be stuck. You know who can fix this? The United States Congress can fix this. The Women's Health Protection Act has been introduced in every Congress since 2013, and right now, the House of Representatives has enough votes to pass it. 48 senators are on it in the Senate, and it is time for a drumbeat to say to Congress, the court has let us down. You need to step in. The Women's Health Protection Act. That's what needs to be on the lips of everybody who supports abortion rights in this country, because we can fix this.
We don't hear Nermeen. Let me ask a question, and we're going to get Nermeen's mic going. Can you talk about the role of Chief Justice Roberts?
Yes, it was so important. The Chief Justice did join the 3 other liberal justices in a dissent. He was clear that the status quo should be maintained, that Texas's law should not go into effect while these legal issues are being worked out. He didn't go as far as the other justices who talked about how clearly unconstitutional this law is, but he was very clear that the right thing to do here is to keep the law from going into effect while the legal battle goes on.
And Nancy, can you explain what the legal challenges are to the ban at the moment and what prospects you think those legal challenges hold?
Well, absolutely. The law is clearly unconstitutional because every court who's looked at a 6-week ban has stopped it. The Supreme Court has been clear for more than 50 years. What Texas did was very sneaky, as Justice Sotomayor put so well in her opinion. They tried to evade court review by deputizing, people in the state, basically anti-choice activists, to enforce the ban themselves through suing doctors, through suing clinic workers, through suing people who support people who have an abortion by driving them or loaning them money. And so, that issue is the one that, I would say very disingenuously, the majority of the Supreme Court said, well, these are complicated legal issues. We have to work them through. They're not complicated. The law denies women in Texas the ability to get an abortion. And that was granted in 1973 in a case from Texas, and has been the law ever since. So, but that is what, Texas, by saying we're not enforcing the law, we're going to give it to individual citizens to be vigilantes. That's what the court is saying is a complicated, unsettled case and why they didn't issue the injunction. But again, as the Chief Justice said, you keep things in place while you're looking at those legal issues. And while the other justices said clearly, Sotomayor, Kagan, Breyer, it is clearly an unconstitutional law. And they basically just rewarded Texas for doing something sneaky.
And if you can explain once again, as you did yesterday, for those who aren't up on this law, the significant, what they did, how they evaded the state, and who now can sue and who can be sued.
Yeah, it's absolutely frightening. So Texas said, we're not going to enforce the law because they knew it would be struck down in a nanosecond. What they said is that any person can sue an individual who assists a woman or a pregnant person having an abortion after 6 weeks, which of course is when most of the abortions, 85, 90%, take place in Texas. So they basically said you can, Amy, if you drove someone to a clinic in Texas, right, I could sue you. I get a bounty of $10,000, plus you're going to pay my attorney's fees, Plus, even if you drove someone to an abortion in Dallas, I can sue you and harass you by suing you in Houston and making you appear in court in Houston or El Paso or the Rio Grande Valley or wherever I feel like suing you, even though you never stepped foot in any of those areas.
And you have nothing to do with the person, the pregnant person perhaps, who is going for an abortion, you, the person who decides to sue.
Oh, yeah, you don't have to know who they are. All you can just be a person who every day goes outside the clinic, you know, yelling and screaming and trying to stop women from getting abortions. You know, and in fact, you know, that was at Whole Women's Health, who is the lead plaintiff in this case, at their clinic in Fort Worth on Tuesday night, when they were providing services right up into the deadline, there were, you know, anti-choice activists outside the clinic. When it got dark, they were shining their lights, you know, into the parking lot. Very intimidating behavior. And these are the people who are now empowered to harass and sue, you know, all over the state of Texas. It's absolutely an abomination. And for 5 justices of the Supreme Court to act like this is business as usual, we've got some procedural issues here, some complicated issues, we're not going to decide. I mean, it is as if Texas said, we're going to deny women the right to vote, but we're not going to enforce it. We're going to let individuals, you know, say, you drove me to the polls, or you told her where the polling place was. And then the Supreme Court said, well, we can't decide this issue because we don't know. Maybe you can do that. Maybe you can't do that. Right? It's the same thing. Deny someone the right to vote, deny someone the right to have an abortion. They are both constitutionally protected, and the Supreme Court has stood by to do nothing.
Nancy Northup, I want to thank you for being with us, President and CEO of the Center for Reproductive Rights. Later in the show, we'll look at how the Taliban treats women and also how the U.S. invasion and forever war affected women's lives in Afghanistan. But next up, we go to Colorado for a major development in the movement for police accountability. 3 Colorado police officers and 2 paramedics have been criminally charged in the death of 23-year-old Elijah McClain. Stay with us. If I Ever Fall by Lee England Jr. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. We look now at a major development in the movement for police accountability. In Colorado, 3 police officers and 2 paramedics have been criminally charged in the death of 23-year-old Elijah McClain that prompted nationwide protests. Elijah McClain was a young black man walking home from a store in the Denver suburb of Aurora in August 2019. He'd bought some iced tea when someone called 911 to report a person looking weird, although he was not suspected of a crime. The 3 Aurora police officers who answered the call tackled McClain to the ground and placed him in a chokehold as he pleaded for his life. A warning to our viewers and listeners, this footage is extremely graphic.
Fighting us in the ground. My name is Elijah McClain.
Yeah, but I'm here to use karate.
That's what I was doing. I was just going home. I'm an introvert and I'm different.
Come out?
No.
Was he out? I heard some snoring.
I just don't like
completely.
going home.
Consciousness.
I'm just different. I'm just different. That's all. That's all I was doing.
It was actually Rosenberg.
I'm so sorry.
Your gun, dude.
I have no gun.
That's why I tried karate.
I don't do that stuff. I don't do any fighting.
Other units that are not here.
Why were you
slow it down a
telling
little
me?
bit.
I'm don't go drugs. I don't even kill flies. I don't eat meat. I'm not a vegetarian. I don't judge people. No,
I don't eat flies. I don't eat meat. I'm a vegetarian. I don't kill flies, he said. And before that, if you could hear Elijah saying, I was just going home. I'm an introvert. I'm different. I was just going home. I'm different. That's all I was doing. I'm so sorry. I have no gun. I don't do that stuff. I don't do any fighting. Why are you taking me? He said. That's the police body camera footage of officers tackling and arresting Elijah as he walked home August 2019. Medical responders who arrived then injected Elijah with a large amount of the powerful sedative ketamine, enough to sedate a large 200-pound man, even though Elijah was just 5'6" and under 140 pounds. He suffered cardiac arrest on the way to the hospital and died several days later. This is Colorado Attorney General Philip Weiser speaking Wednesday after announcing the charges against those involved in Elijah's death.
Late last Thursday, after careful and thoughtful deliberation, the grand jury returned a 32-count indictment against Aurora police officers Randy Rodema and Nathan Woodyard, former Aurora police officer Jason Rosenblatt, and Aurora Fire Rescue paramedics Jeremy Cooper and Peter Chikuniak for their alleged conduct on the night of August 24th, 2019, that resulted in the death of Mr. McClain.
The charges come after the local district attorney decided earlier not to file criminal charges, citing lack of evidence. But protests and an online petition that gathered more than 5 million signatures, this all happening after in Minneapolis, what happened there with the murder of George Floyd. Those protests prompted the Colorado Governor Jared Polis to re-examine the case. This is how Elijah McClain's mother, Shanine McClain, responded to news of the 32-count criminal indictment.
I'm thankful, I'm grateful that they saw what I saw, that he never should have been stopped, that he never should have been brutalized, he never should have been handcuffed, and he never should have been given ketamine. I expect prison for my son's murders and their accomplices, because that's exactly what they did. They're accessories to a crime. And I don't think it should be anything less than that. They need to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law.
We're joined in Denver by Colorado State Representative Leslie Herod. She spoke to Elijah McClain's mother, played a key role in criminal justice reform since his tragic death, including spearheading a bill to ban police use of ketamine. Leslie Herod is also the first LGBTQ+ African-American to hold office in the Colorado General Assembly. Welcome to Democracy Now! Can you start off by responding to the indictments 2 years after Elijah McClain was killed by police and paramedics?
Yeah, well, good morning, and thanks for having me. What I would say, one, is that I echo Ms. McClain's sentiments of being grateful that these indictments have come down. I think that they are a true statement that Colorado believes in police accountability and reform, and that we will hold officers and first responders accountable when they harm someone in our communities. But it was Shanine's voice and her work that led to Colorado passing the largest and most impactful police accountability law in the country, and really working on 3 bills that allowed this day to happen, that called ketamine a use of force by law enforcement, that ensured that we could have special investigations when someone dies at the hand of or at the direction of law enforcement. We banned chokeholds and we ended qualified immunity. And Shanine and her work was central to all of that.
And what are the next steps for the Attorney General's office after this 32-count indictment?
Yeah, the Attorney General will now take his fight to district court, where he will have to plead the case that Elijah McClain was murdered unjustly, and that the officers and the first responders use their authority in a way that was deadly. And so he will have to prove this case. It won't be easy. And so it's important that people who are engaged now continue to be engaged, continue to call for justice, because this is just one step. We have not reached justice yet, not for Elijah.
You know, it's amazing the progress of these indictments, what this means. After Elijah McClain was killed by the police, I mean, he's walking home, sort of dancing, wearing headphones, listening to music. A violinist who played violin for cats and dogs at a local animal shelter. As he said, I'm different. He said, I don't kill flies. I'm a vegetarian. He kept apologizing, saying, I'm so sorry. He said, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. After this happened, even local reporters said they did not pay attention to this until George Floyd was killed. That's when the mass protests happened. Can you talk about that, Leslie Herod?
Absolutely. Well, you know, Colorado and Denver specifically was, you know, at the center of the protest, just like many other cities were across the country. And I remember introducing a bill the first day we got back around police accountability and from the COVID session. And when we gave our first rally and talked about the police accountability bill, this, you know, small, quiet woman stepped up from the crowd. I handed her the megaphone, and she looked at me and looked at the crowd and said, why weren't you here for my son? Why are you here for someone who died states away? But when I called you for support, people of Colorado, for support for my son, no one showed up. And it was interesting because, you know, the crowd kind of turned to me and the MC, like, do you want us to take the microphone back? And I said, no, I want to have this conversation. You know, I asked who her son was when she said Elijah McClain. I knew, right, that her voice needed to be centered in this conversation and that people needed to know who Elijah was. And so from that moment on, we worked lockstep to pass police accountability, again, on 3 bills over the course of a year and a half to make sure that what happened to her son never happened again. But we also raised the profile around her case in a way that gained it international attention and put pressure on the governor of Colorado to act, to tell the attorney general to act. And we put provisions in our bills that specifically related to Elijah McClain's case so that we could get things like the complete body camera footage, so that we could prosecute the case. All of these things were related to Elijah and the other Black and brown men, women, and gender non-binary people in Colorado that have been murdered by the police.
And finally, the response by the Colorado police to the protests once they actually happened after George Floyd was killed, as you pointed out, then talking about Elijah McClain. One of the most moving scenes was the violin vigil, people playing violins in honor of Elijah the violinist, and then beaten by police. How has this changed the way the Aurora police behave, Leslie Herod?
Well, let me tell you one thing that we put in our bill was a pattern and practice investigation. And Attorney General Weiser mentioned this in his press conference yesterday, that they are now under investigation by the state because of the bill that we passed. And if they don't change their practices, they will be sued by the state of Colorado. They are under deep investigation, not only for the treatment of Elijah McClain, but their treatment of so many of Colorado citizens and visitors, and the harm they've caused people at the hands of Aurora PD. The Aurora Police Department, quite frankly, under previous leadership, is a deadly department. If you look at the cases in Aurora, they have far more excessive use of force cases than even, say, Denver, and they're a suburb of Denver. And quite frankly, they need drastic change. And what's happening now is that change is happening. They've got a new chief already, but there is a lot more work to be done. And I will note, folks might not remember this, but because of the police accountability bill, when you have excessive use of force or misconduct, and as a law enforcement officer now in Colorado, you actually lose your post certification. You can never be a law enforcement officer again in the state. And so that is happening to not only these officers, but the officers that mocked the death of Elijah McClain. There were Aurora PD officers that went and took pictures at his death site and mocked it. And those officers are no longer on the force either and won't be able to be law enforcement officers in the state of Colorado again. And so this case has made sweeping changes, but I got to tell you, it would not have happened if it weren't for the protests, specifically the Shanine McClain stepping up and asking Colorado and the rest of the country to speak out, and they did. Initially, Ms. McClain was told that Elijah's murder was justified and that there was no evidence to even do a grand jury or to bring indictments or to do a special investigation. It wasn't until those protests that we were able to make that change. And she is a soldier for continuing to fight and stand up for justice.
We want to thank you for being with us. Colorado State Representative for the 8th District, also the first LGBTQ+ African-American to hold office in the Colorado General Assembly. Next up, Afghanistan. The Taliban say women may not be able to hold senior positions in the new government. We'll go to Kabul to speak to Mahbouba Siraj, president of the Afghan Women's Network. Stay with us.
When it's the feelings I wear, don't touch my soul. When it's a rhythm I know, don't touch my crown. They see the vision I've found, don't touch what's there. When it's the feelings I wear, they don't understand what it means to me. Where we chose to go, where we meant to know. They don't understand what it means to me. Where we chose to go, where we meant to know.
Don't Touch My Hair by Solange. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we turn to Afghanistan, where the Taliban held a parade in the country's second-largest city Wednesday to display the American-made military equipment they've seized or that was left behind after the withdrawal of the U.S. troops. Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby responded by claiming the U.S. has deactivated all the gear U.S. forces abandoned at the airport. Meanwhile, General Mark Milley, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told reporters Wednesday it's possible the United States will coordinate with the Taliban in the fight against the Islamic State. He declined to say whether the U.S. would collaborate with the new Taliban government.
We don't know what the future of the Taliban is, but I can tell you from personal experience that this is a ruthless group from the past, and whether or not they change remains to be seen.
Comes as the deputy head of the Taliban political office in Qatar told the BBC Wednesday that women may not be able to hold senior positions in the new government.
Women also, I cannot say that they will be on the top. If they are not on the top, maybe they will be in the government, in the lower these things, because in every department of the government, ministries, you can say almost half of the workers are women. So they can come back to their work and they can continue. But maybe in this new government which has been announced, in the top post, I mean to say in the cabinet, they may not be women.
The Taliban also have said that women can go on to higher education, to university, but they have to be in separate classrooms from men and taught by women or the elderly. For more, we're joined in Kabul, Afghanistan, by Mahbouba Siraj. She is the president of the Afghan Women's Network, longtime advocate for women's rights. We welcome you to Democracy Now!, Mahbouba, and thank you so much for being with us. You have said that it is a relief that the U.S. military is gone. Can you talk about what's happening in the streets right now and what has happened to women over these last 20 years for the United States, the longest war in U.S. history?
Well, thank you, Ms. Goodman. First of all, going to the part of your question that I said it's a relief that the United States left, because especially if you were in Afghanistan in the past 2 years, and then when they started making the deals with the Taliban as far as the peace agreement was concerned, and then specifically in the last 2 months of it, with the way, because the United States made this agreement with the Taliban that we are going to, you can have, as long as you don't hurt any Americans, you can go right ahead and have that war. Although they were helping the military of Afghanistan from the air, but the rest of it was like, they were just spectators, and the war was going on. And in the last 2 months of it, the situation got a lot worse. The soldiers of Afghanistan were dying left and right, and I mean, everybody was like such a disaster. And then there were all of these thugs all over the city of Kabul or in the provinces, and they were doing their thing. And then there was this war. It was so chaotic that honestly, when they left at that night at 1 minute to 12, I took a deep breath and I said, thank God this is over. Because it was very hard on all of us. It was very hard specifically because of that deal that was made, that we never knew how it was, why it was made like that, and because the United States had an agreement with Afghanistan to be with us until 2024. And then they did all of that. So it's like it was very disappointing, and it was extremely upsetting, the whole thing for me.
Mahbouba, you've also said that what's happening in Afghanistan now could set the country back 200 years. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, the thing is that, Afghanistan went through, in the past 20 years, when the U.S. and the world was in Afghanistan, the whole attention, more than anything else, I mean, purposely and deliberately, and for all the good intention, was given to the women of Afghanistan. The women of Afghanistan actually advanced tremendously during this time. The education of women advanced from the health point of view, from the point of view of the death of mother and child that decreased so much, from the women, taking place in the government and having, high position, from the parliament of Afghanistan, which 30-something% of it were women. All of these, they were achievement for the women of Afghanistan. And the way the Taliban have started with the Afghan woman, especially with education, because you see the same words that are being said right now as an excuse for the children, for example, for the older girls, not up to the class of 6 but above, for them not to go to school, or the excuse that is given at the university because of the fact, that's a fact, we don't have enough cadre people, teachers, professors to teach at the university. So all of this was actually said before. Years before, in 2004 and 5, when the Taliban were here in Afghanistan. So it's a repeat of the same thing, honestly. And that is very disheartening. And that is what, if they continue like this, and this is just another excuse, Afghanistan will go back another 200 years. So this is because the population of Afghanistan, half of it right now are women, the same way the population of the world, more than 50% of it or 52% of it are women. So it's like, one cannot just disregard the women of Afghanistan and say they don't exist. This doesn't work. I mean, for the advancement of the country, for the economy, for the work of every single one of the ministries, for the whole machinery of the governance to turn, Afghan women are needed. So if they are not going to be there, so who's going to do the job? Who's going to be filling up their place? And that's why I'm saying that it's going to go back to 100 years if they are not allowed to take their full part and participate in making Afghanistan a better place for everybody to live.
And Mahbouba, could you respond to those who say that in fact it was really only in urban areas where the situation for women, minorities, journalists, etc. improved, whereas in rural areas there wasn't so much improvement in the last 20 years, and the war was much more visible there. Could you respond to that and explain what you know of the differences between rural areas and urban areas? Here, of course, the focus is principally, if not exclusively, on Kabul.
Yeah, well, to a point, that is the truth. but in the reason for it being, but to a point, and I will explain. That is the truth. But the reason for it being that the Kabul is the capital of the country. So all of the help, everything was kind of concentrated in Kabul. But this also, throughout the years, changed. Other big cities of Afghanistan, like Kandahar, like Herat, like Mazar, they all, like Jalalabad, they all started coming up and taking their part. So then the situation really changed, and women started taking their place even in all of the provinces of Afghanistan, a little bit more, or a lot more actually, than before. But of course, never as much as the center. So that was the truth. But then I believe when it comes to the question of development, in a way, that is the truth anywhere in the world, because it takes a long time for the whole system to be adjusted and to be planned so that everybody A to Z in the country takes advantage of it. So that's what it was. It was nothing done purposely. It was nothing done to keep the women of the provinces of Afghanistan in the dark. But that's how it happened, and it took a while. But right now, if we go back to this situation, it's going to be a lot worse, because then the provinces and they are all going to be completely forgotten, and going to make it a lot more difficult. So that's where we are right now.
Is president of the Afghan Women's Network. But we also want to bring into this discussion Rafia Zakaria, author and columnist who's written a new book. It's called Against White Feminism, Notes on Disruption, that looks in part at the role of women in the push for the United States to attack Afghanistan. Rafia, welcome to Democracy Now! You've called the U.S. war in Afghanistan the first feminist war. If you can go back in time and elaborate. Take us through it.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Amy. It's a pleasure to speak with you and be on Democracy Now! The story of this war, which I call the first feminist war, begins obviously in the years before 9/11 happened, when feminist organization called Feminist Majority was running a campaign to end gender apartheid in Afghanistan. And towards the end of the 90s, this campaign really gained traction because it was championed by the wife of Jay Leno. And she attracted a lot of celebrities like Meryl Streep to the cause.
That was Mavis Leno.
Mavis, yes, sorry. And now when 9/11 happened, the U.S. was looking, for, in a lot of cases, revenge, but also for an argument that would justify its invasion of Afghanistan, given that, none of the 9/11 hijackers were actually, from Afghanistan. So they kind of latched on to this program that was already part of the Feminist Majority. And the leaders of the Feminist Majority actually consulted with the State Department and with the White House before the invasion was announced. They were present when Colin Powell made the announcement for the invasion. And the reason I call it a feminist war, the first feminist war, is because until then, U.S. feminists at least had functioned as a check on the state. They were against war. They were against unjust invasions and interventions. But when this happened, the large feminist organizations and prominent feminists, including Gloria Steinem, supported the incursion into Afghanistan, saying that this would establish democracy, which ultimately, would be good for women's rights. And that's what they did. They essentially allied with the U.S. strategic interest in Afghanistan and allowed for feminism to be used essentially as a cover story for what was a strategic intervention based on U.S. national interests. So the consequence, of course, is what we see today, what your previous guest spoke about, which is that feminism has been delegitimized in Afghanistan because it is associated with an occupying force. And I would say that the reason 200, Afghan women will be sent back 200 years is because of that, is because this sort of misuse of feminism, largely led by white and Western women who wanted to sort of modify Afghanistan in their own image and in ways which they saw best, has completely failed. And now Afghan women are left to pick up the pieces and deal with the Taliban and, hopefully, I don't argue with the fact that changes have happened for women. The part I really get upset about is that, all of those changes took place because of this fragile aid economy that the United States created by pumping a lot of money into the economy and creating a sort of NGO-level workforce of Afghans that catered to the Western presence. And now that the U.S. has left all of that, the house of cards has collapsed. And so all of those people that were serving NGOs or various government arms of the U.S. are essentially not. They don't have jobs. They're not gonna, and the vast majority of them are not gonna be able to leave. And I pin this to white and Western feminism because it absolutely refused, because as you've been showing on your program, there were people saying this for over a decade, well, for me, 2 decades. But there was no, even up to 2011, 2012, there was no room at all within the American public sphere, whether it's Democrat or Republican, to say that, this is actually hurting Afghan women.
Mahbooba, could I ask you to respond to what Rafia has said? The way in which women were used as a pretext for the U.S. invasion, and the fact that the advances that have been made in Afghanistan for women have largely been as a result of the foreign aid economy. Could you respond to that?
Ms. Rafia is being a little bit unfair, I believe, on this situation. I know that there was, that did happen in Afghanistan. There is no doubt about it. But at the same time, it is not that, only that is the result of it. It's not like that. The women of Afghanistan, first of all, from the point of view of education alone, there is so many more girls right now that they have gone to school, graduated from schools, and they are ready to take their lives and keep on going. There are so many, the same way teachers and doctors and nurses and engineers and these are all because the universities were open, because women were allowed to go to a part of their higher education, not necessarily to the United States or to Europe, but to other countries in Asia, also to do and go and do their, complete their education. So that whole thing really changed, was changing. And if we would be given a little bit more of a chance, I'm sure this would have taken root in Afghanistan, and it would have become that majority that we needed in order to really bring about a change in the whole life of the Afghan woman. I know it did not happen that way because it was kind of cut short. And then also, but at the same time, based kind of, taking a part of, what she's saying in her beliefs. To me also, in a way, it is going to show me as an Afghan, and I hope to all of my sisters that they are here in Afghanistan or the ones that they are outside, for us to see what we are going to do from here on. Because you see, Afghanistan is Afghanistan. They are the educated women in there. So far, the ones that have been, not all of them left Afghanistan. Not all of them can leave Afghanistan. So there is going to be that certain category of people that they are educated, and hopefully the education is something that we will fight for, and it will continue. And for me too, it's interesting to see what is going to be happening without the push of the West and the women and the money of the NGOs and all of that.
I wanted to go to just this past July when the former Republican president, George W. Bush, of course responsible for the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, responded with a rare criticism of U.S. policy in Afghanistan today during an interview with the German news outlet Deutsche Welle. This is what he said.
I'm afraid Afghan women and girls are going to suffer unspeakable harm. I'm sad. And Laura and I spend a lot of time with Afghan women, and they're scared.
So here he refers to First Lady Laura Bush. In November of 2001, right after the invasion, Laura Bush delivered the president's weekly radio address, the first time a First Lady took over the president's weekly radio address. This is an excerpt.
I'm Laura Bush, and I'm delivering this week's radio address to kick off a worldwide effort to focus on the brutality against women and children by the al-Qaeda terrorist network and the regime it supports in Afghanistan, the Taliban.
And it wasn't just the First Lady, of course, a Republican. In October of 2001, Democratic Congressmember Carolyn Maloney of New York wore a burqa during a 2001 speech to Congress on Afghan women's rights.
Anyone who was familiar prior to September 11th with how the Taliban treat women should have recognized that the Taliban are capable of doing just about anything. The Taliban have controlled 90% of Afghanistan since 1996, when they unilaterally declared an end to women's basic human rights. The restrictions on women's freedoms in Afghanistan are unfathomable to most Americans. Women are banished from working. Girls are not allowed to attend school.
So that was Carolyn Maloney on the floor of the House wearing a full burqa, her face covered as well. Rafia Zakaria, you document this, but if you can talk about the significance of how this was used immediately, as much or more than going after Osama bin Laden and the justification of the U.S. invasion, and then what's happening, as Mahbouba Siraj says, looking at today, what has to happen.
Well, first of all, I'd like to, respond to something Mahbouba said about this kind of thing, the education, quote unquote, will take root in Afghanistan. I think that is the problem of the approach, is that it's a top-down, trickle-down approach, which was devised by white, middle-class, Western feminists, and then kind of delivered to Afghanistan as an export, rather than an indigenous feminism in Afghanistan. I think the failure is that, yes, Afghan women might be educated, but they don't have the political capacity to safeguard the rights that they have won in the past 20 days. And that the reason for that is this idea of empowerment as something, excised from political radical struggle. Women in Afghanistan were never able to do that in the past 20 years. And
Rafia, we have 20 seconds.
Okay, but in terms of the burqa, those are the theatrics of the West, right? It's this horrible equation that if you're wearing the burqa, you're oppressed. If you suddenly take it off, you're free. And you see, it's truly tragic to see that repeated again 20 years after the initial invasion and as the U.S. draws down. The burqa is not the indicator of
We're going to have to leave it there, but I thank you so much. much for being with us. Rafia Zakaria's new book is called Against White Feminism, Notes on Disruption. And thank you to Mahbouba Siraj in Kabul, president of Afghan Women's Network. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.